I want you to imagine a country. And in this country, poverty is so extreme-like, so deeply systemic, that people are literally losing their lives just because they cannot find a single meal.
Right, they're just starving.
Exactly, starving. And there are absolutely zero natural resources to draw from, none. Geographically, it is so small that if you look at a standard world map, you probably can't even find it,
Yeah, it's just a dot.
if that. And the population density, it is staggering. We are talking about over 7,000 people packed into a single square kilometer.
Wow.
Yeah, to put that into perspective for you, a similar-sized area in India would hold only about 430 people.
I mean, that is just a recipe for absolute disaster. It's a humanitarian crisis where you're essentially just waiting for society to collapse under its
Well,
own weight.
but here's the twist. Today, if you walk the streets of this exact same tiny country, 1 out of every 6 residents you pass is a millionaire.
Which is, it represents one of the most drastic, almost unbelievable economic transformations in human history.
It really is. So, welcome to our deep dive into the Singapore paradox. You brought us this fascinating source document detailing the rise of Singapore. And our mission today is to figure out exactly how a tiny, unwanted landmass with no natural resources and, honestly, no allies managed to manufacture its own economic miracle.
Yeah, manufacture is definitely the right word for it.
And when I say tiny, I mean I was looking at a digital map earlier, and you have to zoom in and zoom in and then zoom in again just to find it. It's like looking for a lost contact lens on a satellite image.
It really is. The entire country is just 719 square kilometers.
That's nothing.
Right, it's over 4,500 times smaller than India.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yep.
Because to understand how a tiny island became so unimaginably rich, we first have to understand why anyone even cared about it in the first place.
Right.
And that really just comes down to its position on the map.
Yeah, geography is totally the starting point of this entire story. So, Singapore is a city-state, meaning it's just one city divided into regions, surrounded by 64 smaller islands.
Some of which they literally built themselves, right?
Exactly, using reclaimed land. But its true value is where it sits. It is sandwiched right between Malaysia to the north and Indonesia to the south.
Okay.
Crucially, it sits right between the Malacca Strait and the Sunda Strait.
And those are those very narrow passages connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, right?
Going all the way back to the 7th century, these routes became the most vital trade paths on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were a merchant in the Middle East or India or Europe and you wanted to trade with East Asia, you had to sail through here.
Because going any other way around was financially ruinous.
Exactly. And because the Malacca Strait was slightly shorter, it became this massive global bottleneck.
It sounds like the ultimate, unavoidable toll booth on a global superhighway. Everyone has to pass through, and whoever owns the land gets to collect the fare.
Pretty much, yeah.
I read the local legend even says that Prince Sangnaila Utama landed there, saw a strange glowing animal he thought was a singa, which is Sanskrit for lion, and named it Singapura, the Lion City.
Right. And the lion's head is still their symbol today.
But wait, if the location was so incredibly valuable, why didn't the locals just build an empire themselves instead of constantly being conquered? I mean, we see the Portuguese take it over in 1509, then the Dutch sweep in and take it in 1603 just to build these highly lucrative seaports.
Well, the brutal reality of history is that while geography might be destiny, you need actual military might to hold it.
Right. You have to defend the toll booth.
Exactly. The global powers of the time recognized the massive fortunes at stake. They saw the toll booth, and they simply outgunned the local rulers to ensure they were the ones taxing the passing ships.
So they didn't care about the people there.
Not at all. They had zero interest in building a nation. They were just securing a very profitable rest stop for their own empires.
So with the Dutch sitting pretty on this massive cash cow, the British East India Company was essentially bleeding money.
Oh, absolutely bleeding money.
Because they are making a fortune across India and Southeast Asia, but they need access to this specific route, and they absolutely do not want to start a full-blown war with the Dutch over it.
Right, they had to get creative to steal the traffic. So in January 1819, a British officer named Thomas Stamford Raffles sails up to Singapore.
Okay.
And at that time, it's controlled by the Sultan Johor.
Yeah.
Raffles bypasses a military conflict entirely and just offers the Sultan a deal.
He just buys it.
Basically, 8,000 Spanish dollars for total control of Singapore. And the Sultan takes it.
Wow. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once the British own this patch of land, they still have to figure out how to lure the cargo ships away from the established Dutch ports.
Right.
And their strategy is wild. They declare that the port of Singapore will have zero taxes.
Completely free for ships of any nation.
That is a massive gamble.
It was a massive gamble. They were willingly sacrificing all that immediate tax revenue that the Dutch relied on.
So how do they make money?
The mechanism behind the gamble was volume. They bet that by making it free, the sheer volume of global trade would explode, bringing in far greater long-term profits through warehousing, resupplying, and sheer commercial momentum.
Okay, that makes sense.
They were also helped by a natural advantage, actually, a coastal slope that was absolutely perfect for safely docking large ships, which the Dutch competitors just didn't have.
You know, it's exactly like a modern tech company offering a highly polished, totally free app.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. You know they aren't charging you to download it because they just want to harvest the massive user base. They want the traffic.
Exactly. They monetize the ecosystem later.
But the dark side of that strategy for Singapore was that the British treated it purely as a business asset. They didn't actually govern the people.
No, not at all.
You have this massive influx of people migrating from China, India, Malaysia, and without civic administration, it turns into a lawless den.
Total chaos.
Gambling, slavery, staggering violence.
Yeah, the British viewed the locals strictly as a source of cheap labor to keep the port running. There was no police force, no public housing, no sanitation.
And it gets so much worse, because the colonial officers unleash a terrifying societal malware onto their users. The British had this massive trade deficit with China, buying all this tea and silk, but China didn't want anything the British were selling, so the British intentionally addict the Chinese population to opium.
It was a cold, completely calculated economic lever. They exported opium from India to China on a massive scale.
But addiction doesn't respect borders.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
That addiction followed the Chinese laborers right back into the port of Singapore.
The numbers in the sources you provided are haunting. By 1847, Singapore had 70,000 residents. 15,000 of them were hardcore opium addicts.
That's incredible.
People were so desperate, so thoroughly addicted, that opium literally became a form of currency. You'd go to someone's house, and instead of offering you a cup of tea, they'd offer you opium. And crime and robbery completely skyrocketed just to feed the habit.
And the British largely ignored the chaos as long as the ships kept moving.
Of course they did.
But a massive engineering project halfway across the world forced them to change their entire approach. In 1869, the Suez Canal opens in Egypt.
Shaving 5,000 miles off the trip from England to China overnight.
That shortcut fundamentally altered global shipping. The volume of ships hitting the Malacca Strait in Singapore went from busy to an absolute explosion.
Right.
The British suddenly realized they couldn't just run a lawless pirate haven anymore. The demand for manpower surged, the wealth surged, and to physically manage the logistics of that much trade, they finally had to bring in police.
Soldiers. Basic infrastructure.
Exactly. Singapore slowly started functioning like a proper colonial outpost.
But the people barely had time to adjust to that new reality before a series of massive global shocks hit them.
Oh yeah, the early 20th century was brutal.
You have the global trade collapse of World War I in 1914, the Spanish flu in 1918 wiping out thousands, the Great Depression in 1929 completely gutting their economy.
Just shock after shock.
I want you, listening right now, to imagine the sheer whiplash of surviving that era. Because just when it seems like society might finally catch its breath, February 1942 arrives.
World War II.
The Japanese army attacks, and in just 7 days, they completely defeat the British forces. 7 days.
The occupation that followed was a pure nightmare.
Public mass killings, people burned alive, forced labor, systematic torture.
Yeah, it lasted until the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs in August 1945.
How does a society mentally recover from being subjected to that kind of systematic horror?
It leaves a permanent scar, no question. But more importantly for this deep dive, it shifts the entire psychological foundation of the people.
How so?
Up until 1942, there was this myth of British invincibility.
Ah, right.
The colonial masters were supposed to be the great protectors of the realm. When the Japanese rolled over them in a week, that myth shattered forever.
They realized they were on their own.
Completely. It permanently instilled a profound do-or-die survivalist mindset in the population. The people of Singapore learned the hardest way possible that they could never rely on an outside power to protect them.
So after the war, the British see the writing on the wall. The old colonial system is dead. So they grant Singapore self-governance.
Yeah, in 1959, they hold their first general elections.
And a man named Kuan Yew, leading the People's Action Party, wins 43 out of 51 seats.
He essentially becomes the founding father of modern Singapore.
But the prize he won was a disaster zone. I mean, he inherits a country where 70% of the people are living in slums.
70%?
He's got communist threats trying to destabilize the region. And domestically, the population is totally fractured.
Deeply divided.
Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities are living in isolated ghettos, divided by ethnicity and language.
Lee realizes that a tiny island in that state cannot survive on its own. So he merges with Malaysia.
In 1963.
Right. Singapore becomes a state of Malaysia, and Lee even makes Malay the national language, just to appease the larger Malaysian government.
It was a marriage of pure necessity.
Exactly.
But the friction is immediate. When Lee's political party tried to contest broader elections, the Malaysian government felt deeply threatened.
And this tension rapidly boiled over into horrific racial riots in 1964 between Muslims and Chinese in Singapore. People were killed, hundreds injured.
So the Malaysian government essentially tells Lee Kuan Yew, look, you need to favor the Malays over the Chinese to calm things down.
But Lee refuses.
He demands that all races and religions be treated equally under the law, knowing that state-sanctioned favoritism would eventually tear the island apart from the inside.
And realizing they couldn't control him, Malaysia did something unprecedented. On August 9th, 1965, they expelled Singapore from the Union.
So what does this all mean for the people on the ground?
It was terrifying.
Right. Usually a country's Independence Day is this joyous, triumphant celebration with fireworks.
A huge party.
For Singapore, it was the exact opposite. They are the only country in the world forced into independence against their will. Lee Kuan Yew actually wept on television during the press conference.
Yeah, that footage is famous.
It was like being violently kicked out of a lifeboat into the open ocean without a life vest, surrounded by sharks.
That's exactly how it felt. He knew they had no resources, no food security, and a deeply divided population that was already prone to violence.
So what's his first move?
Well, he realized instantly that before he could even think about building an economy, he had to stop the people in the lifeboat from killing each other.
Right. So he goes into full social engineering mode. He creates a national flag and anthem to force a shared identity.
And in 1960, he sets up the Housing and Development Board, the HDB.
The plan is to destroy the slums and build cheap government housing, but there is a major catch.
There is.
And honestly, I am really struggling with this part of the source material.
Yeah, it's controversial.
Taking a sledgehammer to the slums is objectively good for public health, but telling a family exactly what floor they have to live on based strictly on their ethnicity, that feels incredibly dystopian. How does the text reconcile that massive government overreach?
What's fascinating here is how Lee Kuan Yew viewed human nature. He believed you couldn't just ask people to be tolerant. You had to use the physical environment to dictate human behavior.
So literally forcing them together.
Exactly. When you got a government apartment, there was a strict quota system. You could not have an all-Chinese building or an all-Indian building.
Wow.
The government literally forced the ethnic groups to live side by side on the same floors, using the same elevators. The text justifies this strictly as a survival tactic.
Because without total national unity, the nation would collapse into civil war.
That was the fear. He physically dismantled generational racism by taking a sledgehammer to the ghettos.
And he applied that exact same logic to education.
Right.
Instead of separate community schools teaching only in their own languages, he built incredibly high-quality, virtually free government schools.
And he made Chinese, Malay, Tamil, and English all official languages.
Everyone was forced to learn English to participate in the global economy, plus their mother tongue. He literally engineered a unified workforce.
And that workforce was about to face its greatest test.
Oh, boy.
Because in 1967, the British announced they are withdrawing all their military forces from Singapore to save money.
Which is terrifying because the British military was Singapore's primary employer.
Yeah, it was the bedrock of their local economy.
By 1970, they are totally gone. So you have a newly independent, impoverished island that just lost a massive chunk of its GDP overnight, defending itself with exactly 2,000 soldiers and 2 wooden ships.
It is incredibly bleak. Lee knows they are incredibly vulnerable to invasion. So he helps form ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
And the underlying logic of ASEAN was brilliant, right?
Oh, so smart. The idea was, if you tightly integrate the economies of all your neighboring countries, they become far less likely to invade you.
Because destroying your economy would crash theirs.
Exactly. It's security through economic entanglement.
But they still had to feed their own people.
Right.
Which begins this absolute masterclass in economic agility. It's like watching a frantic startup founder or a highly skilled surfer constantly catching the next economic wave just before the current one crashes, never getting comfortable.
That's a great way to put it.
First, he looks at this massive swampy area called Jurong and says, "This is our new industrial hub."
He offers zero taxes for years and extremely pro-employer labor laws to any foreign company that sets up a factory.
And it worked.
The mechanism was pure pragmatism. They gave multinational corporations incredibly safe, heavily subsidized land to build on. Within 2 years, 250 foreign companies set up shop, creating 32,000 jobs.
That's insane.
They even became the third largest oil refining center in the world.
Wait, how does a tiny island with zero domestic oil become the third largest refiner on the planet?
Because refining is about capital and location, not extraction.
Okay.
If you make it incredibly cheap and legally secure for global oil companies to build their massive multi-billion-dollar refineries on your shore, they'll gladly ship the crude oil to you from the Middle East.
And then refine it there and ship it to the rest of Asia.
Exactly.
That is brilliant.
Yeah. By 1970, unemployment is basically wiped out.
But Lee Kuan Yew isn't done surfing. He looks around and realizes his people are making things like mosquito coils and cheap textiles.
It's exhausting, low-margin work.
So in 1973, he pivots the whole country again. He targets high-tech industries, electronics, pharmaceuticals, machinery.
But how do you take a population that was largely living in slums a decade ago and suddenly get them manufacturing complex pharmaceuticals?
Right, you have to fundamentally upgrade human capital.
Exactly. He tells global tech investors, come here, and you'll pay zero taxes for 5 years. But the requirement was that these companies had to train the local workforce.
The government also created the Skill Development Fund, taxing low-skill companies to heavily fund massive training centers.
They literally taught their citizens how to solder circuit boards and handle advanced machinery.
And then comes the financial pivot. Singapore was previously taxing bank interest at 45%.
Yeah, 45%. As a result, foreign banks wouldn't touch them.
So Lee simply scraps the tax entirely. Why did that specific move turn them into a global financial center over their neighbors?
Normally, governments want a massive piece of any money parked in their banks. But Singapore looked at the region, saw that international banks were avoiding Asian time zones because of these high taxes, and realized they could corner the market.
So they just dropped it to zero.
By dropping the tax to zero, they weren't losing money. They were attracting hundreds of billions of dollars that simply wouldn't have been there otherwise. This created the Asian dollar market, providing immense liquidity that local businesses could then access for loans.
So fast forward to the 1980s, they pivot again to high-value products, launching high-salary schemes to push out low-wage industries entirely.
And by 1983, this tiny island that used to trade opium for survival is the world's largest exporter of computer hard disk drives.
Mind-blowing. And they build Changi Airport, one of the best in the world, and they build the MRT.
The Mass Rapid Transit System. This wasn't just a train. It was the final physical connector of their social engineering.
Right. By connecting all those perfectly integrated public housing blocks with ultra-efficient transit, they ensured every citizen could get to the new tech and finance jobs seamlessly.
The entire island functioned as a single, optimized machine.
And this incredible momentum brings us to the modern reality. Today, Singapore boasts a 97% literacy rate, top-tier healthcare, a GDP per capita of over $122,000.
First in Asia, second globally.
1 in 6 residents is a millionaire. But that wealth comes with a very heavy societal cost.
Extremely heavy. The success is maintained through a strict, uncompromising legal code that governs almost every aspect of daily life.
I mean, you can be heavily fined or thrown in jail for not flushing a public toilet,
Yeah.
for smoking in the wrong place, for littering, for chewing gum in public. Even connecting to someone else's Wi-Fi without permission is a serious crime.
And drug offenses carry the absolute harshest penalties possible.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, many developing nations look at Singapore's immense wealth and try to copy the economic model.
But according to the text, they almost always fail.
Why is that?
They fail because they try to adopt the tax breaks and the infrastructure without adopting the underlying discipline.
Huh.
Singapore's foundation is built on total national unity and a zero-tolerance policy for corruption. Kuan Yew wasn't playing politics to win popularity contests. He was acting on pure national survival.
So I have to ask you listening to this right now, would you make that trade?
It's a tough question.
Would you willingly give up some personal liberties? Like the right to chew gum or jaywalk or read certain political materials in exchange for a 1 in 6 chance of being a millionaire, having world-class healthcare, and living in a society with virtually zero crime?
This raises an important question about human nature. The results of the Singapore paradox are undeniable. But the method requires a level of social discipline and conformity that most populations simply wouldn't accept.
It is an incredible journey. From a lawless, opium-addicted port city to a traumatized occupation zone to an unwanted territory violently expelled by its neighbor.
All the way to a manufactured economic powerhouse built on sheer, uncompromising pragmatism.
Thank you so much for bringing these sources to the table for us today. It's been an absolutely fascinating deep dive.
Truly a masterclass in human resilience, environmental engineering, and strategic foresight.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If Singapore's entire miraculous rise, all of its discipline and relentless innovation was fueled by the do-or-die pressure of having no resources, no allies, and the constant threat of starvation, what happens to a nation's drive and its core identity once it finally has everything?